Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Micro Focus and Consensus Technologies webinar on exploring the path to universal policy management with Micro Focus and Consensus Technologies. I'll be your host. I'm Don DeRay, and I'm the President and CEO of Consensus Technologies. And I have some guests with me today. So let's just jump right in and head over to the next slide and talk about the agenda today. I'm just going to do a brief introduction of Consensus Technologies. Then I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and I will hand it over to them, and they'll give you a introduction to the Micro Focus portfolio on how we can manage universal policies in the cloud and on-premise. So with that, I'll jump right in and start talking about our relationship. Consensus Technologies has been a Micro Focus partner since we started our company in 2006. We are a preferred consulting partner with them, particularly on the NetIQ side of the house. We have OEM development for them for a couple connectors for their Identity Manager product. We do software procurement and renewals for them. We have a unique engineer as a service program that we provide to their customers. And we also host Micro Focus products in our private cloud and also in Microsoft Azure. So we've been around a long time, have a lot of good experiences with Micro Focus. And I know some of our current customers are on today, so welcome. You're not going to get to hear me talk today. I'm going to turn it over to Micro Focus as soon as I do some introductions. We have on the line with us today, we have Rich Farrell, the CEO of Full Armor. We also have Timothy Sedlak, Director of Product Management at Micro Focus, and we also have Charles Davis, VP of Engineering. So with that said, I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to hand it over to Timothy to kind of get us started. So Timothy, I'm going to unmute you, and you should be ready to go. Stop sharing my screen.
All right. How about that? Can you hear me now, Don?
Yes, I can.
All right. I am going to share my screen as well. So give me just a second here. And Don, would you let me know if you can see the what is policy transformation and what we're talking about?
Yep, you are live.
Great. Well, thanks for the nice introduction, Don. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate Consensus. You guys are great partners. Love working with you guys. But enough effusive praise. I'll jump into what we're talking about here when we talk about policy management. So I want to talk to you guys and bring you up to speed on what we talk about when we're talking about policy transformation. What is it? Why are we talking about it? What do we mean? And basically for us, it comes from a lot of customer feedback. So we've been in the policy management business for quite some time. There's a product, Group Policy Administrator, that's been out since I believe it was mid-2000 when we released GPA for the first time. And that product continues to give you on-premise management of group policy objects or GPOs. And still remains a very strong solution in the market. But what you've said is really like the way it works. You know, there's some good capabilities there, but we have a lot more than Active Directory. And what we heard from people is we like the capabilities of management by policy, but I've got problems because I have policy silos. So I've got Intune, I've got group policy objects, I've got VMware has a policy product. There's a bunch of different silos out there if you've got IoT devices, containers. And of course, when you're trying to manage by policy, you're relying on those technical experts in that one technology to kind of interpret what you mean by security and how we set things by policy. And as we put policies out, we know that policies don't work well across those silos. So you have to translate those, you have to find a way to implement them. And when it comes time to do compliance, and you need reports on that, what generally happens is you go to those individual technology owners and you say, quick, I need a report. We've got an audit and I need to tell the auditor we're doing what we should on each of these different policy silos. So it tends to be an Excel exercise of, here's what we're doing, here's all the incidents we caught, here's how we prevented an attack, if you will. So working across those policy silos is what really makes it difficult to enforce those policies, because you're relying on those people to interpret, deploy, update, not just your company policies, regulatory constraints and compliance mandates as well. And with so many people having their hands into security and policy and control over users and devices, it means that you're using a lot of tools and it makes it really difficult. So we discussed, and with the help of Charles and his engineering team, defining what we call our path to universal policy. So you may or may not have heard about these products as they've existed, and we're right at the cusp of releasing the one at the end here. I want to start at the beginning and talk about AD Bridge, and I'll get into a little detail on each of these products. There's actually 3 here, not 4, even though there's 4 steps. We released a product that managed on-prem Linux with AD Bridge about February of 2019 or so. And that gave us some good capabilities, and more than anything, it gave us some great feedback from our policy customers on how we take it further, what we can do to help. We'll touch on a migration product that actually migrates your policy from on-prem to the cloud. So you take your GPOs and you move them up to Intune. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But we actually, before we jumped to universal policy, we took the feedback that we got and updated our AD Bridge technology. And we went from just Unix or just Linux on-premise to Linux and Unix now across the cloud. And when I say the cloud, I don't mean Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform. Instead of an or, it's an and. So we'll do that policy management across Unix, Linux, in the cloud, any cloud. And you might say, well, that sounds a lot like what universal policy management is. Well, that gives you some core policy capabilities. But with Universal Policy Administrator, we've really built process around that, and a backup repository and conflict management and analysis, and a lot more of, if you're familiar with Group Policy Administrator or NetIQ GPA, UPA is kind of the next logical step to that. It puts process around it, as I mentioned. It gives you some delegation capabilities, role-based access, a lot of reporting capabilities, where AD Bridge is really more of the functional bits, and you can do it within an Active Directory GPO. I'm gonna reach out to Charles and say, Charles, I've given my kind of marketing view of how we differentiate AD Bridge and Universal Policy Administrator. Is there anything you'd add from an engineering perspective that I missed?
I think you covered most of it. There's really, what we were hearing from customers is when we started with AD Bridge and getting the Linux joined to Active Directory and managed under GPOs with all of the cool functionality we added on top of what you normally might understand AD Bridge to be. Really, the big thing was we've got a lot of customers who were telling us we're moving to the cloud. What do how can you help me with that?
Yeah.
And so the process of being able to help customers migrate to the cloud and move those workloads from on-prem to cloud-based resources was what drove us to AD Bridge 2.0. And being able to take those cloud-based resources and join those to on-prem Active Directory and still keep them under complete management using GPOs and authentication against your on-prem AD. So using your native AD credentials for those cloud-based resources, excuse me, and managing those with GPOs. But then when we started looking at UPA, customers were, telling us this is great, but I also have Windows servers and workloads in the cloud, and then I've also got all these roaming Macs that need to be under management. How can you help me with that as well? And that's when we started looking at, okay, we're doing some other interesting things here. We want to get away from forcing customers to use native GPOs, and that's when we started working with the offline repository and being able to build these cloud-based OU structures for your resources that aren't necessarily part of your internal on-prem AD. So, so it was an interesting challenge and an interesting project, following the feedback from the customers to help them not just with the management, but the migration of these resources from on-prem into the cloud.
Absolutely. And as we're on the cusp of releasing Universal Policy Administrator, we're going to continue that feedback loop. I want to jump in and talk a little bit more technically about what AD Bridge is, and I'm going to focus on AD Bridge as it exists today, the second release. So there really is no more AD Bridge 1.0. We've updated it to 2.0. And I want to talk about how people do management without that today. People are pretty comfortable with Active Directory and the services it provides, the identity services, group policy, domain services. You've got your set of domain users and administrators, and they're in control of Windows devices and Windows users in a well-organized structure. And people feel pretty comfortable with that. But if you've seen the statistic, you know that even Microsoft within Azure, they're managing upwards of 70, 80% of Linux resources in the Azure cloud. You would think it would be more Windows than Linux, but by far it's much more Linux servers. People recognize the utility of Linux servers, and they're putting a lot of resources on that. And to do that, they set up a set of local users, and if they're somewhat sophisticated, they're going beyond just let me manage box by box, and are doing some things with scripting. Maybe they're using Chef or Puppet or something like that. But there's a definite management line here on how things are managed. The Linux guys have no insight and don't want any insight into any sort of Active Directory. They don't want to be managed by these guys. The Active Directory guys have no idea. And a little history here. I come from a Windows side, former Microsoft employee, worked on the Active Directory team for a long time. And Charles is kind of the opposite. And I'm going to speak for you a little bit here, Charles. Charles is deep into security engineering from a UNIX, IBM background. So we're really coming at it from the two different perspectives. And, if nothing like AD Bridge existed, I would never have a need to talk to Charles, and I'd be happy in my Windows world and think everything's working just fine. So what we did is kind of bring those worlds together with AD Bridge. And I know it says 1.0 here on the top, but I'm going to talk in general terms of what AD Bridge is. We've extended those identity services. So we're not saying you go take over all those local accounts, but we are saying that if you want to give people access to those Linux and Unix and Mac resources, either on-prem or in the cloud, you can use Active Directory accounts, and you can use the clever grouping and organizational structure that you get within Active Directory to give people authorization and authentication onto these Linux boxes. And we do some group policy here as well. We'll do, I shouldn't say some, I should say all group policy here. So managing it from a GPMC or a group policy management console. So if you're an Active Directory guy, you're pretty comfortable with group policy and the Windows objects and the way you can manage users and devices. You're probably not as comfortable with, what do I do about SSH? What ports are the right ones to open? So with AD Bridge, we've got those identity services for authentication authorization. We've extended group policy and done the appropriate thing for group policy. I will say Charles and his team did a very good job of looking at policy from the Linux, Unix, Mac perspective and building the right things in there. So it's not just, hey, let me set my screensaver or something minimal like that, or build your own IP table. We can do the IP table management, but we can also do a heck of a lot more, even some customized things there. So this is a very broad overview of AD Bridge, and it gives you some basic management capabilities. But as we get into talking about UPA, it's a lot broader. As we extended it to the cloud-based resources, you can even with one instance of AD Bridge connect to multiple cloud providers. So if you're somebody who uses Azure and AWS, and maybe you've got a developer's toe, you're dipping in the water to Google Cloud Platform, we can manage all those with one instance of AD Bridge talking to all those cloud providers. And you can build up structures if you're an Active Directory guy in those OUs and parents and children and who gets access to what and what groups go where in a very structured way to manage Unix, Linux, Mac out in the cloud and put policy around those.
And I can show a little bit of that, Tim, if you'd like.
Yeah, why don't we do that? I think you have the capability to share your screen. I'd love it if you could jump in and just do a very brief one. And then we'll also do a demo on UPA as well. Oh, this is great.
So can you see my screen?
I can.
So what you were talking about with AD Bridge and being able to build out the OU structure and honor all the user group permissions, things like that, really was one of the things that was important to us to bring to AD Bridge 2.0. And what you're going to notice, what's really interesting here is we are actually taking those cloud-based resources. So if you go into ADUC and look at my OU structure, you can see I've got all my Linux machines and I've got it broken out by cloud-based Linux and on-site Linux. And then in my cloud-based Linux, I've got my Linux in AWS and my Linux in Azure and my Linux in Google. And so what we do is we actually are able to do what we call a virtual join to Active Directory. So now they become actual members of AD in the AD OU structure. So for the AD administrators out there, you can manage these cloud-based Linux resources the exact same way you manage your on-prem resources, whether they're Linux from our AD Bridge product or Windows servers and machines. So you can see I've got my Linux machines joined to Active Directory. And now what this allows me to do is go into Group Policy Management Console and start building out the GPOs for these machines. So you can see I've got GPOs that are specific to my on-site and to my cloud-based, and I've even got that down to things like AWS and Azure, just because within the different cloud environments, if you're using their base OS images, they have different rules. They rely a lot on their perimeter security, but we wanted to give the administrators the ability to manage those boxes, audit those boxes, and give them all the power of on-prem Active Directory for being able to work with those resources no matter where they reside. And I'll just open up my global firewall policy real quick to show you how we made it possible to build those GPOs and some of the features and functionality that are built into it.
So Charles, as you do that, one of the things I want to mention is one of the things we heard from people is I want to do this without a VPN. So don't make me VPN to AWS, Azure, So this is all very secure.
These are all highly secure using structured API calls through our environment, through our system. So these machines that you see joined locally to Active Directory do not have a direct pipe between the cloud environment and on-prem AD. It's what we call the identity and access gateway server that allows the structured API calls from the external machines for logon or getting policies to that machine, and then that machine really marshals the requests between Active Directory, and the same for the authentication. And another important thing to mention is for the authentication, if you have cloud-based servers authenticating against your on-prem domain controller, again, no VPN required, and no federation, meaning there's no replication of your users anywhere. We're actually authenticating those users against the on-prem domain controller.
And Charles, one of the pieces that I know was important to customers is, you know, if I remove somebody's access in Active Directory, I don't have to wait for that to replicate out to my user store, because we're actually, we don't maintain a separate user store. We're actually attached to Active Directory and recognize the rights and privileges people have as they're set at real time in Active Directory, right?
Exactly. That goes to that there's no latency because we are authenticating each request over a encrypted tunnel to on-prem Active Directory through that API gateway. And there's no replication of those users, which means there's no latency because Active Directory is the authoritative single user repository. And you can see here, we built out the snap-in for being able to start building the GPOs for your Linux machines. So you can see we have the ability to do firewall rules at the service level or at the IP tables level. So really detailed, complex firewall rules for those machines that are under management. We give you the ability to manage services, so you can make sure that if you're being held accountable to certain compliance standards like CIS or FIPS or NIST, whatever the regulations are, or internal security policies, you can make sure that the firewalls are configured, that certain services are always running, certain services are never started on those boxes. You can manage configuration files for SSH and sudoers, but you can also manage custom configuration files. So this allows you to manage settings within config files for any application running on these Linux machines. Deploy files is a neat feature where you can take an entire file, so an entire configuration file that you want to have locked down and monitored, and you can deploy that as a GPO, and I'll show you that real quick in a second. Execute commands, so I use execute commands for configuring machines when they come online and join Active Directory. It can be running reports, whatever commands you might want to run on those machines remotely via GPO. And then, of course, AD logins, and that is configuring your users to be able to log in to those Linux machines using AD users and groups and the AD user group structure. And it's a little bit different for on-premise and in the cloud, because in the cloud, it's using a different module, but it's still, either way, it still honors the AD user group structure and all the security permissions within Active Directory. So that's a real quick rundown of the snap-in for being able to build out GPOs to manage your Linux boxes, no matter where they reside, either on-prem or in the cloud, and that's cloud agnostic for us. And then some of the other cool things we did was, just like in the Windows world where group policy always wins, we also built in the feature functionality into our Linux client to be able to force GPOs to always win. And what does that mean? That means even if someone logs onto that machine as root and edits a config file that is under management by the GPO, we will, excuse me, we'll identify that someone made a change outside the rules of the GPO. We'll create an alert for your SIM system or your operations team to see that someone is making changes outside of the policies. And then we'll roll that back within 60 seconds. Meaning, if someone were to exploit the machine and you've been hacked, and they try to give themselves elevated permissions, and you keep SSH under and sudoers under management by GPO, if someone goes in and gives themselves elevated permissions, we're going to take those permissions away. We're going to roll those configurations back, and we're going to restart those services in less than 60 seconds. So everybody will be aware that something bad is happening on that box, even if they're logged on as root. And we will notify, roll back, and put the machine back to its desired state.
That's great. I know that
So,
makes it extremely secure, and I love the fact that you brought up the custom configurations as well.
yes, that's true for any application. It can be a custom application. It can be, we didn't want to be in the business of knowing everything that's on the machines and building out, rules and everything for all of the applications out there. So we made it really flexible, where you can do either an entire configuration file, or you can do settings within a configuration file and still have that same level of monitoring and persistence. So I think we're about halfway through the meeting. I can show that feature, or we can schedule a follow-on for a more detailed demo of each of the products.
How about if we come back? I really want to focus your demo time on universal policy. I am going to switch here to share back here. I am just very briefly going to touch on our migration product for policy, Policy Compliance Assessor. So what we heard from people is you have a capability, Microsoft's encouraging you, strongly encouraging enterprises to move from on-premise Active Directory to the cloud. And one of the silos that they have there is Intune. This is where policy settings end up when you move them to the cloud. And they're always, it's telling me you can't see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, good. So Microsoft is constantly evaluating how they move individual settings, thousands of individual settings in policy up to the cloud. And they provided you with programmatic interfaces. So if you're a programmer, you have the capability of writing code that will actually move settings from on-premise to the cloud. Well, what Charles and team did is basically take this manual process of, let me see what Microsoft supports now, let me move settings and remove them from on-premise, to a real process-oriented piece where we'll assess what you have on-premise today, look at the individual settings, see if it's supported in Azure and Intune, and then give you the capability to migrate on a very granular level or a very high level. Migrate all my policies and all the settings that are supported today, and continue to do that evaluation. That's the bottom piece there. And then let you migrate as Microsoft releases more and more capabilities here. So if you're looking at moving from on-premise group policy objects up to Intune in the cloud, this is a good structured, programmatic and process-oriented way that lets you do continuous evaluation and migration up to the cloud. Now, I really want to spend some time on Universal Policy Administrator. As I said, this is kind of the evolution of group policy management. So I know some of the text here is really hard to see. What's important to say is most enterprises are doing some Active Directory group policy management today, and that little circle is lit up green. But we know people have Linux and UNIX and cloud-based applications, some MDM stuff. Like I mentioned, VMware has an MDM solution. There's policies around Office 365 or now Microsoft 365 management. You may have containers. You may even be one of the people that are using IoT and an IoT gateway. Each one of those has constraints and how they're being managed from a security and configuration perspective. And what we've done is recognize the undermanaged and unmanaged resources, including things like non-domain join windows, containers I mentioned before, and put a structure around this with Microsoft Universal Policy Administrator. So it's a centralized location, a central repository for security and configuration settings for the things that live in those policy silos. And this makes life much easier from a security and compliance perspective because you've got one place to go. You're not looking for your MDM guy to translate what some of the privacy protection regulations you may have to comply with, or maybe you're in healthcare and HIPAA is important to you. You don't have to communicate with 5, 10, 15 different people here to establish some security and compliance baselines. You've got one place to go, and that place can be delegated out to the individual experts, but you've got a central repository, a central way of managing and versioning policy for all of this and keeping control over it and watching all the events as they happen and putting structure around that policy. So what does that look like? And Charles is going to show us what this looks like here. So this is a web-based console that lets me pull in, as we look at the left side here, all the resources from Active Directory, different flavors of Linux, some Unix, Mac. I mentioned non-domain join windows. Maybe you're in finances and you've got some kiosk machines or ATM that are Windows-based and they're not joined to your Active Directory, but you still want them to have the benefits of policy. UPA is the way to do that. And we'll report back to you on what environments you're managing, how many connections you have out there, and then let you start to build policy around those. So we'll ingest policies that you have through group policy today, let you layer those on top of Unix, Linux, non-domain join windows, and you see some of the other silos that we're bringing together here. And before I hand back to Charles and ask him to demo, because a demo is always better than slideware, I do want to answer the question I always like to answer from a technology and market perspective. So what? So you can do this. Well, with policy, you can help build barriers of security. And Charles mentioned some of this around AD Bridge. Well, AD Bridge is kind of like the father of UPA. So anything AD Bridge can do, UPA can do, and then it does a whole lot more on top of that with versioning and the corrections and the conflict analysis and reports that it does. So you can establish a baseline of trust. So if you're somebody who are externally facing on compliance standards, you've got one place to go to create reports and demonstrate to auditors that you have process in place so that, like Charles says, somebody comes in and makes a change using a root account, you can show the auditors that you've got controls in place that will set it back to what you've got for policy. Now, one of the pieces Charles also mentioned was around forensic, and he kind of had a short message there around, hey, we'll feed your security team with all the events, but there's also a lot more you can do in forensics. You can do things like hive off or fork off a machine that's being attacked and then spin up a new one while your security team works on that to figure out who's attacking us, what attack are they using, what are they doing. So you can almost turn it into a honeypot on the fly, if you will. And then it helps you simplify the marriage of device management and user management. The final point here about putting process around policy management really helps us bring together the language of security and compliance into one tool to make sure that nobody is making interpretation as to what a strong password is. You can help put policy in place that will translate across all those different silos and work the way you intend them to work, and not just trust that people are going to know what you mean when we add some new compliance, new security standards. And it does give you an easy button. So if you make a policy change or you add a new application in, you need to change to an earlier version of policy, you can easily roll that back. So with that, what I would like to do before I jump to that slide is ask Charles if you could demonstrate UPA for us.
Absolutely. Let me share my screen again. So can you see my screen?
We can. I
So,
see the
as you
UPA log on.
mentioned- I'm sorry?
I was just saying I see the UPA log on screen.
Excellent. So I'm going to log in, and I'm actually logging in to my UPA portal using my administrator credentials from on-prem AD. So I'm logging in. So there's a lot here. I'm kind of going to cover over it as best I can. But Tim, you might want to jump in and stop me where there's certain areas we want to talk about. The first part is you've got a lot of people who might be working with policies. Linux administrators, Windows administrators. You may have people who are going to do editing. You may have different people who approve them or audit, from the security side. So you can see in the administration, we've got a delegation model that allows you to define the different roles. A UPA admin would be someone who has all rights within the system. I'm logged in as a UPA admin right now, and you can see it tells you all the rules and permissions across Windows, Linux, and Mac that those different delegated roles have. So you would see a Linux admin would only have the ability to do certain things within Linux and only be able to see universal policies, because universal policies can have both Linux and Windows settings. But a Linux admin has almost all the permissions you would want for being able to do the work that you need to with Linux. Universal policies, see approvers, auditors. So we built in this delegation model so that you can have the people who perform specific functions be able to be a part of these groups. And these are actually groups with permissions that are set within AD. So you can see whenever I'm going to add a user to a specific role, I'm actually reading my users within my domain. And again, this is reading those users and allowing me to add them to those groups and give them the permissions within the system. And I can also include groups. So it's going to load, and there you can see and you can see there's a lot of the normal groups that you would see within Active Directory, because we're actually reading the groups from Active Directory for being able to apply these roles. It's pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of functionality there to be able to create these roles and permissions for these specific users. And you can see, let's see. What I wanted to show you is also we can create notifications. So whenever if you have people logging into the system and performing specific actions, like working with a universal policy, you may have someone who's an auditor or an approver that needs to go in and be notified so that they can go in and approve or audit a specific universal policy. So you can start going through and selecting the actions and being able to apply those to rules that will then get trigger notifications to people that are within the different groups, and be notified that there's an action that occurred, and therefore there might be an action that I need to go take within the system. So at a real high level, that's the delegation model. Was there anything that I missed on that, Tim?
No, actually, but your phraseology there kind of underlies some of the complexity that you've built into this that makes it a lot more useful. So there's workflow that's associated with this So as somebody checks in a policy, somebody can get notified, and you can keep separation of duty, and so you can go through an approval process, and then once it's approved, you can actually roll out the policy. So just you covering that reminded me that the workflow around this can be as complicated as you want it or as simple as you want it.
That's absolutely correct. We wanted to give some flexibility around, organizations that are really big and have really advanced workflows and processes. So being able to break out those roles or roll them up and give people, more power. So even all the way down to being able to, only allow someone the ability to export policies, universal policies back to GPOs. So from the administration standpoint, that's the way we set up the delegation model. Organization, this is your really your OU structure, and I'll talk about this a little bit. It's interesting. We give you the ability to import your domains. So when you do this, what we're doing is we're looking at your OU structure and importing that so that now you can start working with those policies that were before the import group policy objects, but we import them into our embedded Git repository and convert those into universal policies where they can then be worked with and exported back to GPOs or applied to machines in the cloud that are under management. So this is a representation of my domains, and you can see I've got multiple domains. I can have domains that are trusted or untrusted, and import those in and start working with the policies associated with those domains. What's also interesting here is you can see, I showed you within AD Bridge how you can join the cloud-based resources to your on-prem AD and manage those natively in native tools. And that's still possible with UPA, but what we were hearing from a lot of customers is they saw the security we had in place, but they wanted to separate out and have the cloud-based resources being able to be managed by a cloud team, and the on-prem resources being able to be managed by an on-prem team. And from the customers who we talked to, some of them like the idea of having the cloud-based resources joined to on-prem AD, but others wanted a little bit of separation. But what they did like was the ability to structure their cloud-based resources in an OU-like structure like they're used to with Active Directory. And so what we did was we gave you the ability to add a cloud-based OU and start building out an OU structure for your cloud-based resources under management.
Charles, that's not doing anything in Active Directory. It's all within our Git repository, right? So we're not extending Active Directory or doing anything like that to create these cloud OUs. That's
correct. In fact, I probably should have mentioned that with the AD logins and the GPO structure. We know that the AD schema and your on-prem domain controllers are, those are critical systems, and we have to be hands off on those. We don't install anything or do anything to your on-prem domain controllers other than import into the system so that you can work with the universal policies and export those policies back to GPOs, but only if you explicitly do that. But we don't touch the AD schema. We don't install anything on any of your critical AD domain controllers or servers. We honor Active Directory as it is. You can work with AD users and groups and GPOs, but we don't require anything installed on or editing of the AD schema.
So just keeping an eye on the clock here, Charles. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure we give people a chance to ask a question or two.
Okay. Yes. So you can see I've built out my OU structure similar to what I have on AD, but this is within Universal Policy Administrator. And now what I can do is I can start doing things like adding agents and adding policies and running reports and looking at, all of the things that are typically you would manage within Active Directory in a similar fashion within UPA for your cloud-based resources. And that can be, you can see here, that can be Windows, Mac, or the different flavors of Linux that you want to add to those cloud OUs. So we talked a lot about universal policies, and that's really the core of the product, is working with those policies. So the universal policies are created a couple of different ways. When you first install the product and you import a domain, we import and normalize those GPOs into policies in our embedded Git repository. And because we have that embedded Git repository, that means now you can start doing version control and rollback and things like that. But when they become a universal policy, that allows us to start doing things like working with it and editing it. So I'm going to go and grab, let's see, there's one that's approved. I want to find one with some of my.
And as you look there, Charles, I want to point out that, you know, you see things like pending approval, and that gives you a little insight into some of the things we're doing in the workflow with, you know, checking something out, making sure that the work that you're doing as you investigate, how do I build this universal policy? What's the right setting for Windows, and how do I make that work on Mac or Linux and AWS? You're kind of bringing it all together under that universal policy, and then checking it back in, and before it gets deployed, somebody approves it. So there really is good flow here, and we've learned from what we did in Group Policy Administrator to build in that same kind of workflow here.
Exactly. So you can see the one that I'm working with right now is checked out, and it's a version 4. But you can look up here and you can see I've got this one that's already approved as a V1. You can see I've got one that's pending approval. So that's waiting for someone to go and approve it and check and set it up for export to either cloud-based machines or to a GPO in Active Directory. And you can see on the one that I have open, I've got three settings. So I've got password policies and rules set on that. And you can see I've got my password length, which is 5, and that seems a little off. So I'm just going to make that. It seems like 8 should be a better number, and I'm going to save that. Oh.
So I think you've been moving things around in Active Directory.
I have. I've been working a lot with these policies and re-imported my domain. So let me take a look at this one real quick. And what I'll do is I will just check out.
Because it's a universal policy, it can work across Linux, Mac, Windows, domain joined or not, right?
Correct. That is true. You can have policies for different varieties of. If you want to lump them together and make a password policy for all of your systems, for Linux, Mac, and Windows, you could do that, or you can separate them out by OS. It really depends on how you structure your universal policies and your OUs. Very much like when you're building out your Windows environment.
Right.
And I'm just going to go add a.
So as you do this, Charles, I want to point out that Charles is showing you some of the structure around UPA, some of the workflow, but the things he showed you with AD Bridge also apply here. So the policy that he was demonstrating when he showed you AD Bridge, the enforcement mechanisms is the same. The capability to alert on a change and reset it back to what it should be set by policy is all built into that as well. So, Charles is showing some of the administrative work here, but on the technical back end side, what he showed you in AD Bridge also applies as well. So you've got the administrative side, you've got kind of the technical workhorse side and how it's working on the actual boxes themselves. So I think we really, with UPA, are showing, you know, kind of the administrative work and how we're trying to keep you safe, make it easy to report, make it easy to collaborate with the technology experts. So I'm sorry, I'm stealing your thunder, Charles.
Oh, no, that's okay. So I was just going to show, I know we're getting short on time. So you saw I was working with a policy and it had a minimum password value of 5. That seemed low to me. This one I added and I went with the default of 7, but now I know that there's mismatches in my policies. That doesn't seem right. So one of the things that we added is I want to do a conflict analysis of this policy that I just created across all of my universal policies. I need to understand how many conflicts do I have in my universal policies, which actually originated as GPOs or could be edited and exported as GPOs. And wow, when I look at that, I think, you know, that doesn't look good. What is my password policy for my company supposed to be, and why do I have all these policies that have different values for minimum password length? So this tells me I've got some cleanup to do, and I need to go in and make sure that these policies are getting updated, because we've got some compliance issues there.
And you've got a very active QA team that's creating a lot of policies for you.
Yes, that is very true. But you can see there's the one that I just did with the value of 7, and you can see I've got everything from, you know, 10, 9, 3. That's not good. So, but what this really shows you is we saw that there was a need to, as people are working with their universal policies, they need to be able to do a comparison and do that conflict analysis to make sure they don't have any conflicts in their policies, you know, whether it's logon, you know, password links, security policies, any of those type things. And really the conflict analysis that we're talking about stretches across all the OSs that we support policies for. And I can do things like go in and look at the changes that I made so there's the changes since you can see while I've had that checked out, I've done I added a password length setting. I can do things like go in and look at events on that universal policy, who's been doing what with it. And that really gets into, we talked about the devices, all the devices that are under management, and then the auditing. And the auditing is important because I can go in and I can see who's been logged in and what they're doing. So I can see, oh, there's someone working on the machine at the same time I'm working on it. What's that person doing? So let me go in and see, and I can look at the events. So it looks like he's just logged on there. I can go into events and start looking at, you know, what's happening within the system. So everything that happens and everybody who does something within the system creates an event. So our logging, so that you can also do things like have your operations team build notifications and alerts off specific activity within the system. Or if you have people going in and editing or exporting universal policies as GPOs, you know, maybe you have certain GPOs that shouldn't be touched and you want your SIM system to pick up on that. Any number of things that, but you can see all of the events are logged within the system so that you have the you know, a complete audit trail of who's doing what.
And when you're under the gun, you can actually search for specific events. If you know something is happening or you're interested in a particular resource, you can also search for events related to that policy, that device, that user.
Exactly.
Well, gentlemen, we're about 5 minutes left, and I did want to kind of end the demo here to try to let everybody go ahead and type some questions in the Q&A so that we could have some Q&A here left at the end.
I think that's a great idea, Don. I'm sorry, we just have so much to talk about. So let's see if we got some questions.
Yep, and we'll be very happy to schedule some follow-ups with anybody if they want a little bit more in-depth review of the product. Just reach out to us, and we'll be able to do that. While people are typing in the questions here, I had a question come in earlier. With move to using Azure AD as the primary, directory, is the product capable of using the group policies and things like that are like with Microsoft Intune?
So Intune is one of the policy silos. So as we build out agents, we went strictly with OSs to start out with. That's Windows, Unix, Linux, non-domain join Windows, Mac. So UPA will ship with those, but we're building more modules, if you will, for all the other policy silos. So if you think back to that kind of clock diagram I had, Intune is one of the policy silos that we're going to pull in. It's not there at release on version 1, but we are building it, and we'll definitely get there.
Okay. That is the only question that I have in the queue at the moment. We have about.
Usually I get a question about, how is this licensed? How do we deploy it? How can we make sure that we're managing all of our resources? And the way this works is we're managed by endpoint, or we're licensed by endpoint, I should say. So, if you've got 30 Linux boxes in AWS that you want to cover, and all of your Windows domain boxes, you buy the Windows domain boxes. Say there's 200 machines there you want to cover, and 30 in AWS, you'd buy the 230 licenses. We don't charge for the central repository, the UI, anything like that. All those adjunct pieces come with UPA, and we really only charge for what you end up managing. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yes.
And I will mention we're right at the cusp. I know I mentioned it at the beginning. We're right at the cusp of the release. So UPA should be released here at the end of the month. We're all done with the engineering, the testing, the documentation. But at Micro Focus, we go through a product called P2M, or product to market, that makes sure the technical support guys know what they're doing and can answer questions about it. The sales guys can know who to talk to get demos set up, or even POCs, that the web people know about how to set up trials so people can download UPA and trial it, those sorts of things. So we should see at the end of the month here UPA appear on the web, even though we're technically done with it from an engineering perspective.
Well, sounds good. I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen here. And if anybody has any additional questions, please go ahead and reach out to Concensus, either at sales@consensus.com, or my email address, don.duray@consensus.com. I want to thank everybody for attending today, and I hope you have a safe and enjoyable rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks so much, Don. And Charles, really appreciate all your help, too.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.